My wife pointed at me in front of the judge, who, coincidentally, was her ex-lover, and said, "This man only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve." She was demanding the entire fortune my grandfather had left me in his will. The judge nodded, and her lawyer smiled, certain of victory. Then I said 2 words. That made the judge turn pale. "My name's Miles Turner. I'm 31 years old, and according to my soon-to-be ex-wife Veronica, I'm the human equivalent of a malfunctioning ATM that spits out receipts instead of cash and makes that annoying beeping sound at 3 in the morning." She stood there in the courtroom today, her manicured finger pointed at me like I was some kind of clearance rack disaster, and declared with the confidence of someone who's never been wrong in her entire delusional life, "This man only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve." The dramatic pause she added after that statement was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it at a dinner party for people who enjoy watching their marriages implode in real time. I sat there in my charcoal suit, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion because apparently you need to dress like you're attending a funeral when your marriage is being legally executed, and I tried not to laugh. The thing is, Veronica has always had this flair for the theatrical, like she's constantly auditioning for a reality show that nobody actually wants to watch, but somehow keeps getting renewed for another season. She wore this cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her hair was styled in that way that screams, "I spent 4 hours at a salon so I could look effortlessly devastated." The performance was Oscar-worthy, really. I almost wanted to stand up and start a slow clap, but my lawyer, Samantha, had specifically told me to keep my sarcastic commentary to myself until the appropriate moment, which apparently wasn't during my wife's opening monologue about what a financial catastrophe I am. Behind the bench sat Judge Colin Reeves, and let me tell you, this guy looked like he'd been assembled in some kind of government lab specifically designed to create the most stereotypically handsome authority figure possible. We're talking about a jawline so sharp it could probably slice through butter without breaking a sweat, perfectly graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, and that stern expression that judges practice in the mirror before bed. The kind of face that makes you think, yeah, this guy definitely tells people he doesn't own a television and only reads classic literature in his spare time. But here's the kicker, and I mean the really hilarious, you can't make this stuff up kind of kicker. Judge Colin Reeves wasn't just some random judicial official randomly assigned to preside over the systematic destruction of my marriage. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too straightforward, too lacking in the kind of poetic irony that apparently defines my entire existence. This distinguished gentleman with his fancy robes and his gavel of judgment used to be Veronica's boyfriend back in college. Yeah, you heard that right. My wife, her overpriced lawyer who probably drives a BMW and has a summer house in the Hamptons, and her ex-lover who now holds a position of legal authority are all conveniently assembled in one courtroom, presumably to discuss how I'm some kind of irresponsible man-child who can't be trusted with money, responsibility, or apparently anything more complex than a goldfish. Perfect, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong in this totally unbiased and completely fair legal proceeding? It's not like judges are supposed to recuse themselves when they have personal relationships with one of the parties involved. It's not like there are actual rules about this kind of thing. It's not like the entire American legal system is built on the concept of impartiality and fairness. But hey, who am I to question the process? I'm just the malfunctioning ATM, remember? I watched Veronica lean over to whisper something to her lawyer, and they both glanced at me with these smug expressions that made me want to order pizza directly to the courtroom just to see their faces when the delivery guy showed up. Her lawyer, this guy named Preston Whitmore, who wears cufflinks that probably cost more than my first car, nodded seriously like she'd just shared some profound legal insight rather than probably commenting on how I was wearing the same tie I wore to our wedding. Which, okay, maybe I was doing on purpose because I'm petty like that. Judge Reeves cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like thunder announcing the arrival of some kind of dramatic revelation. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice dripping with that authoritative tone that people develop when they've spent too many years telling other people what to do. "Please proceed with your statement." The way he said "Mrs. Turner" made me wonder if he'd practiced it beforehand, trying to sound professional while simultaneously remembering what it was like to call her other names back when they were young and stupid and probably making terrible decisions at college parties. Veronica stood up, smoothed down her pantsuit in that way that women do when they're about to deliver what they consider to be a devastating blow, and took a deep breath that was so calculated it should have come with a director's cue. "Your Honor," she began, her voice wavering just enough to sound vulnerable, but not enough to smudge her makeup. "I married this man believing he would honor his family's legacy, that he would be responsible with the considerable inheritance he received, and that he would build something meaningful with the resources he was given." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The considerable inheritance she was referring to came from my grandfather, Gerald Turner, a man who'd built his fortune from absolutely nothing, and who'd specifically structured his will in a way that made it nearly impossible for gold diggers to get their hands on it. Grandpa Gerald was old school smart, the kind of guy who could see through bullshit from a mile away and who'd probably predicted this exact scenario while sipping bourbon in his study and laughing at the future chaos. Instead, Veronica continued, really getting into her stride now, playing to the courtroom like it was a theater and she was the tragic heroine. I watched him make irresponsible decision after irresponsible decision, throwing money at failed ventures, ignoring sound financial advice, and treating his grandfather's hard-earned wealth like it was some kind of joke. Except they didn't know something, and this is where the story gets really interesting, the kind of interesting that makes you lean forward in your seat and forget about the lukewarm coffee you've been nursing for the past hour. They didn't know that I'd seen this ambush coming from about a mile away, maybe further if we're being honest. See, Veronica thinks I'm stupid, that I'm some kind of naive trust fund kid who stumbled into wealth without developing any actual survival instincts. Judge Reeves probably thinks I'm just another entitled defendant who's about to get schooled in the harsh realities of divorce court. Her lawyer definitely thinks he's about to win the easiest case of his career and probably add another summer house to his collection. But here's the thing about me that nobody in this courtroom seems to understand. I don't play chess. That slow, methodical, predictable game where everyone can see your moves coming from 3 turns away. No, I play something far more satisfying, something I like to call revenge Sudoku. You know that feeling when you're solving a puzzle and everything suddenly clicks into place, when all those numbers that seemed random suddenly form a perfect pattern that makes complete sense. That's exactly what's about to happen here, except instead of numbers, we're working with lies, secrets, and judicial misconduct. I glanced at Samantha, my lawyer, who was sitting next to me with a manila folder that contained enough evidence to turn this entire proceeding on its head. She caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod, the kind of subtle gesture that means, just wait, it's going to be so worth it. And she was right, because in about 10 minutes, I was going to stand up and say 2 words that would wipe those smug expressions off every single face in this courtroom. But for now, I sat back and let Veronica continue her performance, because the best part of Revenge Sudoku is watching your opponents think they've already won right before you show them the completed puzzle. Let's rewind this dumpster fire of a marriage about 3 years, back when everything looked perfect from the outside, like one of those Instagram posts where people pretend their lives are magical while secretly crying in bathroom stalls. 3 years ago, Veronica and I were what you'd call a Pinterest couple, the kind that makes single people simultaneously jealous and nauseous. We had the filtered smiles that made our teeth look unnaturally white, the matching vacation shirts that announced to everyone at the beach that yes, we were that couple, and captions under our photos like, "Forever my king," with enough heart emojis to make a cardiologist uncomfortable. Yeah, she deleted those posts later, probably around the same time she started Googling how to divorce someone and take everything they own at 2 in the morning when she thought I was asleep. We met at this charity event in downtown Manhattan, one of those fancy galas where rich people gather to feel good about themselves while drinking champagne that costs more than most people's weekly grocery budget. I was there managing my late grandfather's tech foundation, trying to honor his legacy by actually doing something meaningful with the fortune he'd built from scratch. Veronica, on the other hand, was there raising awareness, which apparently meant taking approximately 700 selfies with orphans and posting them with hashtags like blessed and giving back and making a difference, none of which involved her actually writing a check or doing any real work. But hey, awareness is important, right? The orphans definitely felt more aware after being used as props for her social media content. I spotted her across the ballroom, and I'll admit, she was stunning in that way that makes you temporarily forget about red flags, common sense, and your grandfather's warnings about women who smile too much. She wore this emerald green dress that probably cost enough to fund a small scholarship, and her laugh carried across the room like wind chimes in a hurricane, loud enough that everyone had to acknowledge it. She was holding court with a group of older donors, and I watched her work the room like a professional politician, touching arms, leaning in conspiratorially, making everyone feel like they were the most important person she'd talked to all evening. My buddy Marcus, who dragged me to this event because apparently I needed to get out more after Grandpa's death, elbowed me in the ribs and said, "Dude, that's Veronica Ashford. Her family owns half the art galleries in Soho. She's way out of your league." I should have listened to Marcus. I really should have. But instead, I walked over there like an idiot with a glass of wine I didn't actually want to drink and introduced myself. "Miles Turner," I said, extending my hand like I was applying for a job I was definitely unqualified for. "I run the Turner Foundation." She looked me up and down with these eyes that seemed to calculate my net worth faster than a Bloomberg terminal, and then she smiled. God, that smile should have come with a warning label. "Veronica Ashford," she purred, taking my hand with fingers that were softer than anything I'd ever felt. "I've heard so much about your grandfather's work. He was a true visionary." The thing is, she made it sound genuine. She had this way of making you feel like every word out of her mouth was the absolute truth, like she'd been personally invested in your life story since birth. We talked for hours that night about philanthropy, about legacy, about what it means to actually make a difference in the world. She laughed at all my jokes, even the terrible ones that usually get me nothing but polite silence. When I made a stupid pun about charity work being philanthropic, she didn't just laugh. She threw her head back like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all year. I should have known right then that something was off, because that joke wasn't even remotely funny. Within 3 months, we were engaged. Within 6 months, we were married in this ridiculous ceremony in the Hamptons that cost more than some people's houses and featured ice sculptures that melted faster than my judgment apparently had. My friends all told me I was moving too fast, that I barely knew her, that maybe I should slow down and actually figure out if we were compatible before legally binding myself to her for eternity. But I was in that stupid phase where love makes you ignore every single warning sign, like driving straight toward a cliff because the view is pretty. My grandfather, Gerald Turner, had passed away about 8 months before I met Veronica, and I was still processing that loss in the way that men do when they don't want to admit they're devastated, which is to say I wasn't processing it at all. Grandpa Gerald was old money with new morals, a rare combination in a world where rich people usually fall into 2 categories: those who pretend they earned it all themselves, and those who don't even pretend. He believed in loyalty above everything else, in hard work even when you didn't need the money, and in calling things exactly what they were, which is why he referred to croissants as fancy bread and refused to pay $12 for coffee when the diner down the street sold it for $2. He'd built his fortune in tech back before tech was cool, investing in companies that everyone said would fail and then laughing all the way to the bank when they didn't. But he never forgot where he came from, never forgot what it was like to have nothing, and he made sure I understood that wealth was a responsibility, not a free pass to be an asshole. When he passed, he left his entire estate to me, every penny, every property, every investment account with numbers that made my accountant need to sit down. Veronica pretended to be supportive when we went to the will reading, sitting next to me in that lawyer's office that smelled like old leather and broken families. She held my hand and made all the appropriate sympathetic noises while the attorney droned on about trusts and holdings and legal structures that I barely understood. She even cried a little, which I thought was sweet since she'd only met Grandpa once at a Christmas dinner where he'd looked at her like she was a problem he couldn't quite solve. But then came the part where the lawyer got to the actual distribution of assets, and that's when I felt Veronica's hand tighten around mine like a vice grip. The entirety of Gerald Turner's estate, the lawyer said, reading from documents that were probably older than I was, is to be inherited by his grandson, Miles Alexander Turner, with no provisions, allowances, or distributions to any other parties. The silence in that room was deafening. I could hear Veronica's breathing change, could feel the temperature drop about 20 degrees. Her supportive smile froze on her face like a computer screen that just got the blue screen of death. We'd been married for exactly 2 months at that point, and I watched in real time as she realized that her name wasn't mentioned once in that will, not even as a footnote, not even as an afterthought. Grandpa Gerald had structured everything so that only I had access, only I had control, and only I could make decisions about what happened to his life's work. She recovered quickly, I'll give her that. Within about 5 minutes, she was back to being supportive Veronica, patting my arm and saying things like, "We'll figure this out together, baby, and your grandfather would be so proud of you." But I saw that flash of something in her eyes, something that looked suspiciously like calculation mixed with disappointment, and I should have paid more attention to it. I should have recognized it for what it was, the exact moment when our marriage stopped being about love and started being about money. After the funeral, Veronica's attitude changed faster than my Wi-Fi signal when it rains, which is to say it went from perfectly functional to completely useless in about 30 seconds flat. One day, she was the grieving, supportive wife who brought me coffee in bed and told me everything would be okay. And the next day, she was walking around our apartment like she was auditioning for a part in The Real Housewives of Betrayal, complete with designer sunglasses indoors and an attitude that could curdle milk from across the room. She started dressing differently too, trading in her casual elegance for outfits that screamed, "I'm about to spend someone else's money, and I want everyone to know it." We're talking about labels I couldn't even pronounce, shoes that cost more than my first car, and handbags that probably required a down payment and financing options. The conversations changed too, shifting from normal married couple stuff like, "What do you want for dinner?" and "Did you remember to pay the electric bill?" to what I can only describe as thinly veiled interrogations about my financial plans. She started talking about our future investments, with this gleam in her eye that made me feel like I was being sized up by a shark that had just spotted a particularly juicy seal. By our future investments, she apparently meant her new Tesla that she absolutely needed because her perfectly functional BMW was so last season, and my inheritance, which she'd somehow convinced herself was a joint asset despite literally zero legal documentation supporting that fantasy. I tried to ignore it at first, because that's what you do when you're desperately clinging to the idea that your marriage isn't circling the drain faster than water in a broken bathtub. I wanted to believe that love was real, that it was something permanent and meaningful, not just rented for however long the money lasted. I made excuses for her behavior, told myself she was just adjusting to our new financial situation, that she'd calm down once everything settled. I was basically gaslighting myself, which is impressive in its own pathetic way. But then came the late nights at yoga class, which apparently ran until 11 p.m. and required her to come home smelling like expensive cologne that definitely wasn't the kind they spray at yoga studios. I'm not an idiot, despite what Veronica might tell you. I know what yoga smells like, and it's usually a combination of sweat, incense, and that weird rubbery scent from the mats. It doesn't smell like Tom Ford cologne and guilt. She'd stumble in with this flush on her cheeks that had nothing to do with downward dog poses and everything to do with activities I didn't want to think about too carefully. Then there were the lipstick smudges on her collar that were definitely not her shade. Veronica wore this specific burgundy color that she'd special ordered from some boutique in Paris, but these smudges were more of a coral pink, the kind of shade that my mom used to wear to church on Sundays. When I pointed it out one time, she looked me dead in the eye and told me it must have rubbed off from her friend Sarah during a hug. Sure, Veronica, because that's how lipstick works. People just transfer entire makeup applications through friendly embraces like they're sharing the flu. And don't even get me started on the mysterious friend who kept texting her at 2 in the morning with heart emojis and messages like, "Thinking about you," and "Can't wait to see you again." Her phone became this extension of her body that she guarded more carefully than nuclear launch codes. She'd take it into the bathroom with her, sleep with it under her pillow, and practically have a panic attack if I got anywhere near it. One time I picked it up to hand it to her when it was ringing, and she snatched it out of my hands like I was about to discover the location of buried treasure. I started sleeping in the guest room around this time, telling myself it was because I had early meetings and didn't want to disturb her, but really it was because lying next to someone who's actively betraying you is about as comfortable as sleeping on a bed of nails while someone plays death metal at full volume. Our apartment, which used to feel like home, started feeling like an elaborate stage set where we were both playing characters in a show that had been canceled, but nobody had bothered to tell the actors. Her best friend Tasha was the one who finally confirmed what I already knew deep down, but didn't want to admit. We ran into each other at this bar in Tribeca where I'd gone to drink away my suspicions and maybe make some questionable life choices. Tasha was 3 margaritas deep, which is apparently the exact amount of alcohol required to override friendship loyalty and activate truth-telling mode. She slid onto the bar stool next to me, her words slightly slurred, and said, "Miles, you're a good guy. You deserve to know." I ordered her a water and myself another whiskey, because I had a feeling I was going to need it. "Know what, Tasha?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Sometimes you need to hear the words out loud to make them real, to transform them from suspicions into facts. She looked at me with these sad, sympathetic eyes that made me want to throw up. "Veronica's been seeing someone. She reconnected with her college ex a few months ago." She paused to sip her water like she was building up courage. "It's Judge Colin Reeves, the guy who presided over that corruption case last year. They dated for like 3 years back at Columbia." The whiskey I'd just swallowed suddenly tasted like gasoline and regret. Judge Colin Reeves. The name rattled around in my brain like a pinball, hitting every possible trigger point. I'd heard about him, read articles about his tough-on-crime stance and his reputation for being uncompromising in the courtroom. He was also known for being unmarried, handsome in that distinguished older man way, and apparently still interested in my wife. "How long?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Tasha winced. "Since right after your grandfather's funeral. Maybe even a little before." "I'm sorry, Miles." I told her she was being stupid, that she was throwing away something good. But she just kept saying you didn't understand her, that you were too focused on your grandfather's legacy to pay attention to her needs. She made air quotes around the word needs, like even she didn't buy that excuse. I sat there processing this information while the bartender polished glasses and pretended not to eavesdrop on what was clearly a dramatic moment. So Veronica had reconnected with Judge Reeves, a man who now sat on the New York State Supreme Court bench, right around the time she realized she wasn't getting direct access to my inheritance. The timing was so convenient, it was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was actually funny. "Thanks for telling me," I said to Tasha, signaling the bartender to close out my tab. "I mean it. I needed to know." She grabbed my arm before I could leave. "What are you going to do?" I smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that happens when you realize you've been playing checkers while everyone else thought they were playing chess, but you're about to flip the board and introduce them to a completely different game. "I'm going to do what my grandfather would do," I told her. "I'm going to be smart, patient, and absolutely ruthless when the time is right." That was 6 months ago. 6 months of playing the oblivious husband while gathering evidence, documentation, and building a case that would make Veronica regret ever underestimating me. Before he died, Grandpa Gerald pulled me aside during what would be our last Thanksgiving together, a meal where he insisted on carving the turkey himself despite the fact that his hands shook like he was operating a jackhammer. And he said something that didn't make sense to me at the time, but makes perfect sense now. "Miles," he said, pointing at me with a gravy-covered fork like he was a wizard bestowing ancient wisdom with a magical utensil. "Trust no one who smiles too wide in a courtroom or a family dinner." At the time, I thought he was just being his usual paranoid self, the kind of old-school businessman who'd survived 3 recessions and 4 divorces among his business partners. But now I realize he wasn't being paranoid at all. He was being prophetic, like some kind of financial fortune teller who could see gold diggers and corrupt judges in his crystal ball. He left me everything when he died, but it wasn't just a simple inheritance where some lawyer hands you a check and wishes you good luck. Oh no, Grandpa Gerald was way too smart for that basic approach. He left me instructions, hidden files that were encrypted better than CIA documents, investment portfolios that required 3 different passwords and a fingerprint scan to access, and backup accounts scattered across so many banks that I needed a spreadsheet just to keep track of them all. The man had more layers than an onion that had been crossbred with a Russian nesting doll and then wrapped in security clearance red tape for good measure. It took me about 3 weeks after his death to actually understand the full scope of what he'd left me, and another 2 weeks to stop feeling like I was in some kind of spy movie where I was the completely unqualified protagonist who'd accidentally stumbled into international intrigue. I'd spend my evenings in his old study, which still smelled like his cigars, and that specific brand of old man cologne that they apparently stop making once you turn 70, going through documents that revealed just how brilliant my grandfather actually was. I found files detailing every asset under a private holding company called the Turner Foundation Group, which sounded boring and philanthropic enough that nobody would look twice at it, but was actually a fortress of financial protection that made Fort Knox look like a piggy bank with a broken lock. The company owned properties in 12 different states, held patents on technology that I didn't even know existed, and had investment portfolios that were diversified so perfectly that even a complete economic collapse wouldn't put a dent in them. And here's the beautiful part, the detail that made me want to dig up Grandpa's grave just to high-five his corpse. The entire thing was owned entirely by me, Miles Alexander Turner, with corporate structures so tight that not even Veronica could touch a single penny without my explicit signature, notarized approval, and probably a blood sample for good measure. There were provisions in the company bylaws that protected against divorce, lawsuits, and what Grandpa's lawyer called predatory marriage dissolution attempts, which is legal speak for gold diggers trying to steal your money when they decide they're done pretending to love you. Every asset was held in trust structures that required unanimous board approval to access. And guess who was the only board member? That's right, yours truly. Grandpa had essentially built me a financial panic room that no divorce lawyer in the world could break into, no matter how expensive their suit was or how many Latin phrases they knew. I remember sitting in that study at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents and half-empty coffee cups, when I found the letter he'd left specifically for me. It was in his handwriting, which looked like a drunk spider had learned cursive and then tried to teach it to other drunk spiders, but I could make out the words well enough. Miles, it read, "If you're reading this, I'm dead, which means I don't have to pretend to like your wife anymore. I saw what she was the moment you introduced her at Christmas. That woman looks at you the same way people look at lottery tickets, like you're a potential jackpot, not an actual human being. I've protected everything I built from people like her my entire life, and I'll be damned if I'm going to stop just because I'm dead. The company is yours, completely and totally yours, and I've made sure that nobody can take it from you unless you're stupid enough to sign it away yourself. Don't be stupid, Miles. Be smart, be patient, and when someone tries to screw you over, and they will try, make sure you screw them back twice as hard. With love and zero regrets, Grandpa Gerald." I actually laughed out loud when I finished reading that letter, alone in that study at 2 in the morning like some kind of maniac. But it wasn't a crazy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd just realized that they'd been holding a royal flush this entire time, while everyone else at the table thought they were bluffing with a pair of twos. That's when I knew Grandpa hadn't just left me money. He'd left me armor, weapons, and a battle strategy all rolled into one perfectly structured corporate entity. He'd seen this exact scenario coming from miles away, probably the moment Veronica started asking too many questions about his estate planning at that Christmas dinner. While I was being an idiot falling in love, he was being a genius preparing for war. And when Veronica filed her lawsuit 6 months later, claiming I was financially irresponsible and deserved to have the inheritance redistributed because I couldn't be trusted with it, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because this irresponsible man, this supposed financial disaster who couldn't manage money according to his gold-digging wife, had just outplanned every single one of them. I had documentation proving that every single dollar was protected, that every investment was legitimate, and that the Turner Foundation Group was running more efficiently under my management than it had in the last 5 years of Grandpa's life. I'd hired forensic accountants who confirmed that not only had I not wasted the inheritance, I'd actually grown it by 18% through careful investments and strategic portfolio management. I had tax returns showing every charitable donation, every business expense, every transaction documented with the kind of meticulous detail that would make the IRS weep with joy. And most importantly, I had evidence that every single claim Veronica was making in her lawsuit was either an outright lie or such a twisted interpretation of the truth that it would make a pretzel look straight. But I didn't reveal any of this during the preliminary hearings. I sat there quietly while her lawyer made wild accusations about my supposed incompetence, while Veronica performed her one-woman show about being a victim of my financial recklessness. I let them think they were winning, let them get comfortable and confident. Because Grandpa had taught me one final lesson that wasn't written in any of his documents. The best time to strike isn't when your enemy expects it. It's when they think they've already won. The day before court, I sat in my lawyer's office, which was located in one of those Manhattan high-rises where even the elevator ride costs more than most people's lunch, and the receptionist looks at you like she's personally offended that you have the audacity to exist in her presence. Samantha Brooks had an office on the 42nd floor with windows that overlooked Central Park, which was apparently lawyer code for, "I'm successful enough to charge you $800 an hour and make you feel grateful about it." The office was decorated in that minimalist style that rich people pretend means they're sophisticated, but really just means they paid someone $10,000 to make the room look empty. There was abstract art on the walls that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto a canvas and then sold it for the price of a small car, and a bookshelf filled with leather-bound legal volumes that I was 90% sure were just for show because everything's digital now anyway. Samantha herself was sitting behind her desk, which was this massive slab of dark wood that probably required the sacrifice of an entire forest, looking over the case files with the kind of intense concentration that surgeons usually reserve for open-heart procedures. She was sharp in every sense of the word, from her perfectly tailored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment to her wit that could slice through bullshit faster than a hot knife through butter. She wore her hair pulled back in a tight bun that meant business, and her reading glasses were perched on her nose in that way that made her look like a sexy librarian who'd sue you for overdue books and win. She looked up from the files, took off her glasses, and fixed me with a stare that made me feel like I was being cross-examined even though I was technically the client. "Your wife's lawyer is a shark," she said, her voice carrying that New York accent that somehow made everything sound both tough and elegant at the same time. "Preston Whitmore doesn't take cases he thinks he'll lose, which means he believes he's got something solid. The judge is clearly biased based on the preliminary hearings I sat through, where he smiled at your wife more than a judge should smile at anyone who isn't his own daughter. And according to my research, they have a romantic history that goes back over a decade." She paused for dramatic effect, which lawyers apparently learn in law school along with how to bill clients for every 6-minute increment of their time. "You sure you don't want to just fake a coma? It might be easier than what we're about to walk into." I leaned back in the uncomfortable leather chair that was probably designed to make clients leave faster so Samantha could bill more people per day, and I couldn't help but laugh. "If I fake a coma," I told her, feeling that familiar mix of dark humor and genuine anger that had become my default emotional state over the past few months, "Veronica will probably unplug me for the insurance money. She'd probably live stream it on Instagram with a caption like "releasing negative energy from my life," with a bunch of prayer hand emojis." Samantha smirked, and it was the kind of smirk that suggested she'd seen enough terrible divorces to write a book that would make Stephen King look like a children's author. "Fair point," she said, tapping her pen against the desk in a rhythm that sounded like she was planning something diabolical. "Then let's burn them alive, legally speaking, of course. I don't need to lose my license over your divorce, no matter how satisfying it would be to watch." That's when we really got down to business, spreading documents across her desk like we were planning a military invasion rather than a court case. We'd been building our counterattack for months, ever since Tasha had spilled the beans about Veronica and Judge Reeves at that bar in Tribeca. I'd hired a private investigator named Danny Rodriguez, a former cop who'd gotten tired of dealing with actual criminals and decided that following cheating spouses was more lucrative and less likely to get him shot. Danny was good at his job, the kind of good that made you wonder if he'd been trained by the CIA or just watched too many spy movies and took notes. Danny had found old photos of Judge Reeves and Veronica together that painted a picture clearer than anything Picasso ever created, assuming Picasso had been interested in documenting infidelity and judicial corruption instead of weird cute people. There were photos from college parties where they were draped over each other like discount curtains, pictures from political fundraisers where they stood together with the kind of body language that screamed, "We're definitely sleeping together," and even one particularly damning image from a campaign gala where Veronica was literally sitting on Judge Reeves' lap while he ran for his current position. That photo alone was worth every penny I'd paid Danny, and I'd paid him quite a few pennies. But the real goldmine was the text messages. Danny had managed to retrieve deleted texts from Veronica's cloud backup, which she'd apparently forgotten existed because people who cheat are usually too arrogant to cover their tracks properly. There were messages between her and Judge Reeves that could qualify as romantic fan fiction, the kind of stuff that would make a romance novelist blush and possibly reconsider their career choices. Messages like, "Can't wait to see you tonight, my love," and "Thinking about our future together once this divorce is finalized," and my personal favorite, "Once we get his money, we can finally be together the way we deserve." That last one was particularly special because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. This wasn't just about Veronica wanting a divorce. This was a coordinated effort between her and Judge Reeves to systematically rob me using the legal system as their weapon of choice. They'd planned this whole thing, probably over expensive dinners and hotel rooms that Veronica had charged to our joint credit card because she was ballsy like that. Samantha had organized everything into a presentation that would make corporate executives jealous. She had timelines, photo evidence, text transcripts, financial records showing suspicious transfers, and even testimony from witnesses who'd seen Veronica and Judge Reeves together at restaurants and hotels around the city. She'd basically built a case that could sink a battleship, let alone expose a corrupt judge and his gold-digging girlfriend. "The key," Samantha explained, pulling up a particular photo on her tablet that showed Judge Reeves and Veronica at a restaurant just 3 weeks before our court date, "is timing. We can't reveal this too early, or they'll find a way to spin it or get ahead of the story. But we also can't wait too long, or the judge will rule before we have a chance to expose him. So when do we drop the bomb?" I asked, feeling that familiar surge of adrenaline that came from knowing you held all the cards but hadn't played them yet. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me glad she was on my side and not working for Veronica. "Tomorrow, during your testimony. We let them think they're winning. Let Veronica perform her little victim routine. Let Preston Whitmore make all his dramatic accusations about your supposed financial incompetence. And then, right when they're feeling most confident, right when Judge Reeves thinks he's about to rule in their favor and ride off into the sunset with your ex-wife and your money, you stand up and say 2 words that will change everything." "What 2 words?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Conflict of interest," Samantha said, her eyes gleaming with the kind of professional satisfaction that lawyers get when they're about to destroy someone's life in a completely legal way. The day of the trial felt like walking into a soap opera directed by Satan himself. Assuming Satan had gone to film school and had a particular interest in making my life as uncomfortable as humanly possible, while also ensuring maximum dramatic tension for entertainment purposes. I woke up that morning with the kind of knot in my stomach that usually accompanies food poisoning or watching your bank account after your wife goes on a shopping spree. Except this time it was mixed with the electric buzz of knowing that I was about to blow up everyone's carefully constructed house of cards and watch them scramble to pick up the pieces. I put on my best suit, the navy blue Armani that Grandpa Gerald had bought me for my 30th birthday with a note that said, "Dress like you've already won," and I stood in front of my mirror practicing my poker face. The goal was to look calm, collected, and maybe slightly defeated, like a man who'd already accepted his fate and was just going through the motions. I needed Veronica and her team to think they had this in the bag, that I was just another dumb husband about to get cleaned out in divorce court, while they all celebrated with champagne that I'd technically be paying for. The courthouse was one of those imposing buildings that looks like it was designed specifically to make people feel small and insignificant, with columns that reached up to the sky like stone fingers pointing at heaven and saying, "Good luck getting justice, buddy." I met Samantha on the steps, and she looked like she was ready to go to war wearing designer heels and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Ready to make some people very uncomfortable?" she asked, adjusting her blazer in that way that meant she was locked in and focused. "I was born ready," I told her, which was a lie because nobody is actually born ready to watch their marriage get dissected in public while their wife's ex-boyfriend pretends to be impartial from behind a judge's bench. But you have to say something confident even when you feel like your insides are doing gymnastics routines. We walked into the courtroom, and I swear the temperature dropped about 20 degrees when I crossed the threshold. The room smelled like old wood, expensive cologne, and the dreams of people who'd come here hoping for justice and left with nothing but debt and disappointment. The gallery was surprisingly full for a civil case, probably because word had gotten out that this was going to be entertaining. I spotted a few reporters in the back, some gossip blogger who'd apparently decided my divorce was newsworthy, and even Marcus, my buddy who'd introduced me to Veronica in the first place and who now looked like he was attending a funeral for his own terrible judgment. Then Veronica made her entrance, and let me tell you, she didn't just walk into that courtroom. She strutted like she was on a runway in Milan, and the entire world had gathered specifically to admire her outfit. She wore this black dress that probably required a team of designers and cost enough to fund a small nonprofit for a year. The kind of dress that says, "I'm a grieving wife who's been wronged," while simultaneously screaming, "I'm about to take everything you own and look fabulous doing it." Her hair was styled in perfect waves that had probably taken 3 hours to achieve, but were meant to look effortlessly elegant. And she wore a pearl necklace that was big enough to fund a small village's education system for a decade. She walked past me without making eye contact, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown timer to my supposed financial destruction, trailing her signature perfume that used to make me weak in the knees, but now just made me want to open a window. Her lawyer, Preston Whitmore, followed behind her like a well-dressed shark that had smelled blood in the water and was ready to feast. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my first car and had that slick back hair that screamed, "I win cases by intimidation, and also I definitely have a yacht." Judge Reeves entered last, because apparently judges like to make an entrance too, and everyone stood up like we were in church worshiping at the altar of jurisprudence. He looked exactly like he had during the preliminary hearings, distinguished, authoritative, and like he was barely suppressing a smile every time he looked at Veronica. The man wore his robes like they were designer clothes, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable, that your position protects you from consequences, and that nobody would dare question your impartiality, even when you're clearly sleeping with one of the parties involved. "Please be seated," he said, his voice booming through the courtroom like he was announcing the apocalypse rather than a divorce proceeding. "We're here today for the case of Turner versus Turner, regarding the dissolution of marriage and the distribution of marital assets." Preston Whitmore stood up immediately, smoothing his tie like he was about to deliver a Tony Award-winning performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy and false sincerity, "my client married a man who squandered his family's wealth on useless ventures. She believed she was entering a partnership with someone responsible, someone who would honor his grandfather's legacy. But instead she found herself tied to a man who treats money like monopoly currency and makes decisions with all the wisdom of a teenager who just got his first credit card. I wanted to stand up and ask him if by useless ventures he meant the 3 startups I'd funded that were now employing over 200 people, or the scholarship program I'd established at my grandfather's alma mater, or maybe the community center I'd helped build in the Bronx. But Samantha had warned me to keep quiet during this part, to let them dig their own graves with their lies and exaggerations. Judge Reeves nodded along like Preston was reciting gospel truth rather than fiction, his expression serious and contemplative in that way that judges do when they're pretending to be objective while actually having already made up their minds. "Continue, counselor," he said, his eyes briefly flicking to Veronica with a look that was way too warm for a judge looking at a plaintiff. "My client has suffered emotionally and financially," Preston continued, pacing in front of the bench like a predator circling wounded prey. "She's watched helplessly as Mr. Turner made irresponsible decision after irresponsible decision, throwing away money that could have secured their future, that could have built something meaningful. She's asking this court not for revenge, but for protection, for the redistribution of assets that she believes she deserves after supporting him through his reckless behavior." Samantha whispered next to me, her voice barely audible. "He's laying it on thick. He's overconfident." I whispered back, "He's in her pocket." She whispered, "He was in her dorm room first." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, because inappropriate laughter during your divorce trial is apparently frowned upon, even when your lawyer makes jokes that are objectively hilarious given the circumstances. The bailiff, an older guy who looked like he'd seen every type of crazy that courtrooms had to offer and was deeply unimpressed by all of it, shot us a warning look that said, "Shut up, or I'll make you regret it." The trial continued with Preston calling character witnesses who were mostly Veronica's friends, People who'd never liked me anyway and were more than happy to testify about what a terrible husband I'd supposedly been. After lunch, which I spent in a deli across the street stress eating a pastrami sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret, while Samantha reviewed our evidence one more time, we reconvened in the courtroom for what Preston Whitmore had dramatically announced would be the most crucial testimony of the day. He said it like he was introducing a headlining act at Madison Square Garden rather than my lying ex-wife who was about to commit perjury in front of a judge she was sleeping with. But I guess everyone needs their moment of theatrical glory. Veronica took the stand with all the grace and poise of someone who'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror approximately 7,000 times. She placed her hand on the Bible with this solemn expression that would have made Meryl Streep jealous, and she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which was hilarious considering I'd never seen her tell the complete truth about anything more serious than her coffee order. She settled into the witness chair like it was a throne specifically designed for wronged women, smoothing down her black dress and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue even though she hadn't actually cried yet. Preston approached her with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for handling delicate antiques or talking to toddlers who'd just fallen off a swing. "Mrs. Turner," he began, his voice soft and sympathetic like he was addressing a trauma survivor rather than a woman who'd spent the last 6 months planning how to rob her husband using the legal system. "Can you tell the court about your experience being married to Miles Turner?" And that's when the performance began. Veronica took a deep, shuddering breath that would have earned her a callback for any Broadway production, and she looked directly at the jury box even though this wasn't a jury trial, which showed she'd been watching too many legal dramas and couldn't tell the difference between television and reality anymore. "It's been difficult," she said, her voice wavering just enough to sound vulnerable, but not enough to make her nose run and ruin her makeup. "When I married Miles, I thought I was marrying someone who shared my values, someone who understood the importance of financial responsibility and building a secure future together." I wanted to interrupt and ask her which values she meant specifically, whether it was the value of cheating on your spouse with a judge or the value of lying under oath. But Samantha's hand on my arm reminded me that I needed to keep my mouth shut for just a little bit longer. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. "He's wasted millions," Veronica continued, warming up to her role like an actress hitting her stride in the second act. "Absolutely millions of dollars on projects that any reasonable person could see were doomed to fail. He funded some ridiculous tech startup that claimed they were going to revolutionize something or other. I can't even remember because there were so many of them. He threw money at charities without even researching if they were legitimate. He bought properties that made no financial sense whatsoever." Preston nodded encouragingly, like a director pleased with his star's performance. "And did you try to discuss these financial concerns with him?" "Of course I did," Veronica said, and now the tears actually started, right on cue, sliding down her cheeks in perfect streams that somehow didn't smudge her mascara because she'd probably used that waterproof expensive stuff that costs $40 a tube. I begged him to be more careful, to think about our future, to honor his grandfather's memory by being responsible with what he'd been given. But he wouldn't listen to me. He treated me like I was just being paranoid, like I didn't understand business or finance. She paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at Judge Reeves with those big watery eyes. "He doesn't deserve a cent of that inheritance, Your Honor. He's proven over and over again that he can't be trusted with it." The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of someone in the gallery sniffling, probably one of Veronica's friends who'd bought into this fictional narrative she was selling. Even the court reporter looked moved. Her fingers paused over her stenography machine like she needed a moment to process the tragedy of it all. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it at a dinner party for people who appreciate dramatic irony. She was sitting there claiming I'd wasted money my grandfather had worked for, completely glossing over the fact that Gerald Turner wasn't her grandfather, had never been her grandfather, and had actively disliked her from the moment they met. She was literally crying about money that had never belonged to her, that she had no legal claim to, and that she'd only gotten access to because I'd been stupid enough to add her to some credit cards. Preston let her performance breathe for a moment, letting the fake tears do their work on anyone in the room who was gullible enough to believe them. "Mrs. Turner," he finally said, his voice heavy with manufactured sympathy. "In your opinion, what should happen to the inheritance?" Veronica straightened up, wiping her eyes and somehow looking both vulnerable and determined at the same time. "It should be protected," she said firmly, like she was proposing something noble rather than attempting legalized theft. "It should be put into a trust, managed by professionals who actually understand finance, not just thrown away on whatever random idea pops into Miles' head. That money represents decades of hard work, and it deserves better than to be wasted by someone who's proven he doesn't respect it." Preston nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. Your Honor, the plaintiff rests." Judge Reeves looked at Veronica with an expression that was way too warm, way too familiar, and way too inappropriate for a judge looking at a plaintiff in his courtroom. "Thank you for your testimony, Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice gentle. "I know this must have been difficult." She smiled weakly at him, a smile that said, "Thank you for understanding," but also said, "See you later tonight when we celebrate winning this case." The whole exchange made me want to vomit all over the plaintiff's table, but I managed to keep my pastrami sandwich down through sheer force of will. Judge Reeves turned to our side of the courtroom, and his expression changed from sympathetic to vaguely hostile. "Mr. Brooks, does the defense wish to cross-examine?" Samantha stood up, buttoning her blazer. "Actually, Your Honor, we'd like to call Mr. Turner to the stand." Judge Reeves looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to actually testify, like he'd assumed I'd just sit there quietly while they robbed me blind. "Very well," he said, gesturing to the witness stand. "Mr. Turner, please take the stand." I stood up, feeling every eye in the courtroom on me as I walked toward the witness box. Veronica smirked from her seat at the plaintiff's table, probably thinking this was going to be easy, that I'd fall apart under questioning or say something stupid that would seal my fate. Her lawyer looked pleased, like a cat that had just cornered a mouse and was ready to play with it before going in for the kill. Judge Reeves leaned back in his chair, confident and relaxed, probably already drafting his ruling in his head about how he was going to redistribute my inheritance to make his girlfriend happy. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the witness box carrying a simple brown folder that contained enough evidence to detonate every single plan they'd made. The bailiff swore me in, and I placed my hand on the Bible, promising to tell the truth, which was exactly what I intended to do, though probably not in the way any of them expected. Samantha approached me with a slight smile. "Mr. Turner, before we discuss the specifics of your financial management, there's something we need to address with this court." Then I said the two words that wiped the smug grin off every single face in that courtroom. Two words that made Judge Reeves go pale and Veronica's eyes go wide with panic. Two words that changed everything in an instant. Conflict. Interest. "Excuse me," Judge Reeves stammered, and I have to say, watching a man who'd spent the entire morning looking smug and comfortable suddenly transform into someone who looked like they'd just realized they'd accidentally walked into the wrong bathroom was absolutely priceless. His face went through about 17 different shades of color in the span of 3 seconds, starting with his normal distinguished tan and rapidly progressing through pale pink, worried white, and settling somewhere around, "Oh shit, I'm about to lose everything" gray. His hand, which had been casually resting on his gavel like it was a scepter symbolizing his unquestionable authority, suddenly gripped it so tightly that his knuckles turned white enough to require medical attention. I stood up from the witness box with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're holding a royal flush while everyone else at the table has been bluffing with absolutely nothing, and I walked over to the evidence table with my brown folder like I was delivering a package that contained someone's entire future destruction, which, to be fair, I kind of was. The courtroom had gone so quiet you could have heard a pin drop from 3 floors down, and I swear even the air conditioning system seemed to pause its humming just to witness what was about to happen. "These are you and my wife, correct?" I said, placing the first photo on the evidence table with the care of someone handling a bomb that was about to explode in everyone's faces. It was a picture from their college days, taken at some frat party where they were both significantly younger and significantly drunker, wrapped around each other like they were trying to merge into a single person. Veronica's face in the photo was flushed with alcohol and whatever else college kids do at parties, and Judge Reeves, who back then was just Colin, looked like he'd won the lottery and was showing off his prize. I placed down another photo. "Fundraiser 2019. I announced like an auctioneer selling pieces of their credibility to the highest bidder. This one showed them at a political event, standing close together in that way that people who are definitely sleeping together always stand, where their bodies are angled toward each other like magnets that can't help but be attracted. Veronica was wearing a red dress that I vaguely remembered buying her, which added another layer of irony to the whole situation. And Judge Reeves had his hand on the small of her back in a gesture that was way too familiar for people who were supposedly just old acquaintances. Lake House, 2021. I continued, dropping another photo that showed them sitting on a dock together, their feet dangling in the water, looking like an advertisement for romantic getaways that destroy marriages. The date stamp on this one was particularly damning because 2021 was after Veronica and I were married, which meant this wasn't just ancient history from their college days. This was active, ongoing, present tense betrayal. And this one, I said, placing down the final photo with a flourish that would have made a magician jealous. Romantic dinner, 2022. That one's my favorite, really. Nice tie. By the way, Your Honor, I think my wife bought you that one with our joint credit card, so technically I helped pay for your date night outfit, which is thoughtful of me, don't you think? The photo showed them at an upscale Italian restaurant in the West Village, the kind of place where appetizers cost $40 and the breadbasket requires a small loan. They were holding hands across the table, gazing at each other with the kind of expression that romance novels try to describe with phrases like smoldering intensity or passionate longing. Judge Reeves was wearing a burgundy tie that I actually did recognize because I'd seen the credit card charge, and Veronica had claimed it was a gift for her father, which was obviously a lie since her father had been dead for 5 years. The courtroom stayed silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 15 seconds, which in courtroom time is the equivalent of several geological ages. I could hear someone in the gallery gasp, probably one of the reporters who just realized they were sitting on a story that would dominate the news cycle for the next week. The court reporter's fingers had frozen over her machine, suspended in midair like she'd forgotten how to type. Even the bailiff, who I'd assumed had seen everything in his decades of courtroom service, looked shocked enough that his usually stoic expression had cracked into something resembling surprise mixed with secondhand embarrassment. Samantha stood up with the kind of dramatic timing that lawyers practice in front of mirrors, probably while wearing their robes and pretending they're in a movie. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter that had been left out on the counter too long. "This is a serious ethical breach that fundamentally compromises the integrity of these proceedings. We're filing for your immediate recusal based on clear evidence of personal bias, conflict of interest, and what appears to be an ongoing romantic relationship with the plaintiff. No reasonable person could look at this evidence and believe you're capable of presiding over this case impartially." Judge Reeves opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish that had been pulled out of water and was trying to remember how breathing worked, and then finally managed to croak out, We're not. This is irrelevant. These photos are old. They're taken out of context. They don't prove anything about my ability to judge this case fairly." I almost laughed at the audacity of his defense, which was basically, "Sure, I'm sleeping with the plaintiff and have been for years, but trust me, I can totally be objective about giving her all of her husband's money." It was like a referee in a football game saying, "Yeah, I'm best friends with one of the teams and we vacation together, but I promise I'll call the game fairly." "Really?" I asked, my voice dripping with enough sarcasm to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. "Because it looks like you two have shared more than just court documents. The photo from 2022 is dated 3 months ago, Your Honor. That's not ancient history. That's not some college romance that ended decades ago. That's you taking my wife out to dinner while I was at home thinking we were working on our marriage. So unless you've got a twin brother who also became a judge and also likes expensive Italian food and also likes wearing ties that my credit card paid for, I'm pretty sure this proves you've got more conflicts of interest than a politician at a lobbyist convention." Veronica's face had transformed from smug confidence to something that looked like a mixture of panic, anger, and the dawning realization that her entire plan had just imploded faster than a badly built sandcastle at high tide. Her perfectly applied makeup was starting to show cracks. Mascara that had survived her fake crying session was now threatening to run for real. and her hands were gripping the table in front of her like she was trying to anchor herself to reality. Preston Whitmore, her shark lawyer who'd been so confident just 20 minutes ago, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear into whatever lawyer hell exists for attorneys who take cases without doing proper background checks on judicial bias. He was frantically flipping through papers like he might find some legal precedent that said it's totally fine for judges to rule on cases involving their secret girlfriends, which, spoiler alert, doesn't exist because that would be insane. Judge Reeves' hands were trembling now, actually physically shaking like he'd developed a sudden neurological condition or had consumed 17 espressos in rapid succession. He looked at Veronica with an expression that screamed, "Why didn't you tell me he knew?" And she looked back at him with an expression that screamed, "I didn't think he was smart enough to figure it out." And I stood there enjoying their silent panic communication like it was the best television show I'd ever watched. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like the entire span of human history, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, while Judge Reeves sat there looking like a man who was watching his entire career circle the drain in real time and couldn't figure out how to grab the sides and stop the descent. His face had progressed beyond gray into a color that I didn't even know humans could turn, something like greenish pale with undertones of, "I'm about to lose my pension and my reputation simultaneously." Sweat was actually beading on his forehead, which was impressive considering the courtroom's air conditioning was set to Arctic tundra like most government buildings. He cleared his throat approximately 17 times, making sounds like a car engine that was trying to start but couldn't quite turn over, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he tried to figure out some way to salvage this situation. The problem was, there was no salvaging it. I'd just presented photographic evidence of his relationship with the plaintiff in front of a courtroom full of witnesses, including reporters who were probably already typing headlines like "Judge's Secret Romance Exposed in Divorce Case" or "Judicial Misconduct Scandal Rocks Manhattan Courtroom." Finally, Judge Reeves managed to form actual words, though they came out sounding strangled and desperate, like a man trying to convince people that the building wasn't on fire while flames were literally visible behind him. "Mr. Turner has presented," he began, pausing to clear his throat again because apparently his vocal cords had decided to stage a protest against having to admit defeat, "substantial proof of what could be considered inappropriate conduct that might, potentially, possibly suggest a conflict of interest that could, theoretically, impact the perception of impartiality in these proceedings." I wanted to interrupt and say could be considered, might suggest. "My guy, you were literally holding my wife's hand in an Italian restaurant while I was at home eating microwave dinners. There's no might about this situation." But I managed to keep my mouth shut and let him continue digging his own grave with qualifiers and legal hedging that fooled absolutely nobody. Samantha stood there with her arms crossed, looking like a prosecutor who'd just gotten a murder suspect to confess on the witness stand, and she wasn't about to let him off easy with wishy-washy language. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel, "with all due respect, this isn't a matter of perception or theoretical conflicts. This is documented evidence of an ongoing romantic relationship between you and the plaintiff. The only appropriate course of action is immediate recusal and potentially a full investigation by the Judicial Ethics Board." Judge Reeves flinched at the words "Judicial Ethics Board" like she'd physically slapped him across the face. Those 4 words represented the end of everything he'd worked for, the destruction of a career he'd spent decades building, and probably the loss of the comfortable lifestyle that came with being a respected judge in New York. His eyes darted to Veronica, and I saw something pass between them, some kind of silent communication that said, "We're screwed and there's no way out of this." The courtroom had erupted into whispers and murmurs, the kind of collective reaction that happens when people witness something so dramatic it requires immediate discussion with whoever's sitting next to them. The reporters in the back were frantically scribbling in their notebooks or typing on their phones, probably filing stories that would be online before we even left the building. Marcus, my friend who'd been watching from the gallery, had his hand over his mouth like he was trying to contain either laughter or shock, possibly both. Judge Reeves looked around the courtroom, seeing his reputation crumbling in real time reflected in the faces of everyone present. And I guess he decided that the only way to save even a shred of his dignity was to make a decision so fast that maybe people would think he'd been planning to do the right thing all along. He straightened his robes, picked up his gavel with a hand that was still shaking, and spoke with as much authority as a man could muster while his entire world was imploding. "This court," he announced, his voice now louder and more decisive, like volume could somehow restore his credibility, "cannot proceed under these circumstances. The evidence presented creates an appearance of bias that fundamentally undermines the integrity of these proceedings." After reviewing the case file and considering all testimony presented today, it is the ruling of this court that the plaintiff's claims regarding the defendant's financial mismanagement are without sufficient merit. Veronica's head snapped up so fast I thought she might have given herself whiplash, her eyes wide with disbelief, and her mouth hanging open like someone had just told her that money wasn't real and nothing she'd done for the past 6 months had actually mattered. Preston Whitmore actually dropped his pen, which clattered onto the table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the moment, and his expression suggested he was already mentally composing his resignation letter or possibly planning which country he could flee to where nobody would hear about this embarrassment. Judge Reeves banged his gavel, and he banged it with the kind of force that suggested he was trying to end this nightmare as quickly as humanly possible. Like if he hit the gavel hard enough, maybe time would rewind, and he could undo every terrible decision he'd made in the past year. The inheritance remains with the defendant as per the terms of Gerald Turner's will and the established corporate structures. Case dismissed. The words "case dismissed" hung in the air like fireworks, and I felt this rush of relief mixed with triumph, mixed with the kind of satisfaction you get when karma finally catches up to people who absolutely deserve it. The entire ruling took maybe 30 seconds, from start to finish, and Judge Reeves had ruled in my favor so fast you'd think his gavel was literally on fire, and he needed to put it down immediately before it burned through his hand. The reporters rushed out of the courtroom like someone had just yelled "free money" in the hallway, practically trampling each other in their eagerness to break this story to their editors and get it online before their competitors. I could already imagine the headlines, the think pieces about judicial ethics, the social media outrage, and the cable news segments with lawyers discussing the implications of what had just happened. Veronica just stood there, completely frozen, looking like a statue of someone experiencing the worst day of their life. Her mascara was now actually running, creating black rivers down her cheeks that ruined the carefully constructed image she'd been maintaining all morning. The pearl necklace that had looked so elegant earlier now just looked expensive and pointless, like she'd dressed up for a party that had been canceled. Her lawyer was gathering papers frantically, probably trying to figure out if there was any possible appeal or motion they could file, but we both knew this was over. As I packed my folder, moving slowly because I wanted to savor this moment like a fine wine that had been aging for exactly the right amount of time, Veronica finally found her voice. She leaned in close to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with the scent of desperation and defeat, and she whispered, "You've destroyed everything." I smiled at her, and it wasn't a cruel smile or an angry smile. It was just the simple smile of someone who'd played the game better than she had and won. "No, sweetheart," I said, using the pet name I'd called her throughout our entire marriage, but now with enough irony to power a small city. "I just unplugged your fairy tale. You tried to rob me using your ex-boyfriend as your inside man. And you forgot that my grandfather was smarter than both of you combined. He saw you coming from a mile away, and he built protections that you couldn't crack even with a corrupt judge in your pocket." Her face contorted with rage and humiliation, going through expressions faster than a slot machine cycling through symbols, and for a moment I thought she might actually take a swing at me right there in the courtroom. But instead, she just grabbed her designer purse, spun on her expensive heels, and stormed out like a character in a soap opera who'd just delivered their dramatic exit line. Her lawyer, Preston Whitmore, trailed behind her like a defeated bodyguard who'd failed to protect his client from the consequences of her own actions, his $800 an hour confidence completely shattered. 6 months later, I was sitting in my grandfather's garden, the one he'd cultivated for 40 years with the kind of obsessive attention that most people reserve for their retirement portfolios or their fantasy football teams. watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked like someone had spilled a bottle of expensive wine across the horizon. The garden was my favorite place on the entire estate, probably because Grandpa Gerald had spent more time here than anywhere else during his final years, sitting on this exact bench and smoking cigars that his doctor had explicitly forbidden, but that he enjoyed anyway, because he'd reached the age where following medical advice seemed less important than enjoying whatever time he had left. I wasn't alone, which was a nice change from the past few months where I'd spent a lot of time by myself processing everything that had happened, dealing with the media circus that had erupted after the trial, and generally trying to figure out what life looked like when you weren't constantly fighting off gold diggers and corrupt judges. Sitting next to me was Jasmine Clark, a journalist I'd met during the absolute chaos that followed my courtroom victory. And by met, I mean she'd shown up at my apartment trying to interview me for a piece she was writing about judicial corruption, and I'd accidentally charmed her by answering the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt that said, "I survived my divorce, and all I got was this lousy shirt and my entire inheritance." Jasmine was different from Veronica in every way that actually mattered, which is probably why I was sitting here feeling calm and happy instead of paranoid and suspicious like I had been throughout my entire marriage. She was smart in that genuine way where she actually knew things instead of just pretending to be interested in whatever topic would impress whoever she was talking to. She was grounded, meaning she understood that having money didn't make you special. It just made you responsible for not being an asshole about it. And most importantly, she didn't see me as a walking ATM machine with a pulse, which was refreshing after spending 3 years with someone who'd probably calculated my net worth before she bothered to learn my middle name. We'd been joking about writing a book called How to Lose a Wife and Win a Lawsuit, which we both agreed would be a bestseller if we included pictures, particularly the photo of Veronica's face when Judge Reeves dismissed the case, which had been captured by about 17 different photographers and had become a minor internet meme under the caption, "The exact moment she realized she wasn't getting any money." Jasmine had suggested we could do a whole coffee table book of terrible courtroom moments, and I'd countered that we should include recipes for stress eating throughout legal proceedings, starting with my personal favorite of pastrami sandwiches that taste like cardboard and regret. "You know what the best part is?" Jasmine said, leaning back on the bench and looking up at the sky like she was searching for constellations in the fading light. "You could have been bitter about all of this. You could have spent the past 6 months being angry and cynical and deciding that all people are terrible and love is a lie. But instead, you're sitting here making jokes about writing a satirical self-help book about divorce." I shrugged, taking a sip of the bourbon I'd poured from Grandpa Gerald's personal collection, the expensive stuff he'd been saving for special occasions, and that I figured not getting robbed by my ex-wife qualified as. "Being bitter takes too much energy," I told her, which was something my grandfather had said to me once when I'd asked him how he'd managed to stay relatively cheerful despite being divorced 3 times and betrayed by multiple business partners. Plus, Veronica's probably bitter enough for both of us right now, so why duplicate the effort? That was an understatement, actually. In the 6 months since the trial, Veronica had essentially vanished from public view like a magician's assistant who'd gone into the box but never came back out. The scandal had destroyed her carefully cultivated social media presence, where she'd positioned herself as this sophisticated philanthropist who cared deeply about causes, because it turned out that people don't really want to follow someone who tried to steal millions from their husband using a corrupt judge as their accomplice. Her Instagram, which had once boasted over 100,000 followers who apparently cared about her opinions on yoga and green juice, was now private and presumably filled with nothing but those followers who enjoy watching train wrecks in slow motion. Rumor had it, and by rumor I mean Tasha had told me while drunk at a bar again, because apparently that woman could not keep secrets when alcohol was involved, that Veronica had tried to sell an NFT of her apology letter, which she'd written not to me, but to the public, explaining how she'd been misled and manipulated into the whole scheme. The NFT thing was particularly funny because it suggested she'd learned absolutely nothing about money or dignity or how to read a room, and also because apparently nobody bought it, not even for the meme value, which had to hurt worse than the actual scandal. Judge Reeves had fared even worse, if that was possible. He'd resigned within a week of the trial, citing health issues in a statement that fooled absolutely nobody because the health issue was clearly sudden honesty about being corrupt. Yeah, the health issue was that his career had flatlined faster than a heart attack patient who'd refused medical attention. The Judicial Ethics Board had launched a full investigation, which was still ongoing, but had already resulted in him losing his law license pending the outcome, which meant he'd gone from being a respected judge to being an unemployed scandal subject in the span of about 30 days. The schadenfreude was delicious, I'm not going to lie. Every time I saw an update about the investigation or read another think piece about judicial ethics written in response to my case, I felt this warm glow of satisfaction that probably wasn't entirely healthy, but that I was going to enjoy anyway because I'd earned it. Under my leadership, Grandpa's companies had actually thrived in ways that would have made him proud enough to come back from the dead just to give me a high five and tell me, "I told you so." I'd introduced employee ownership programs that gave workers actual stakes in the companies they were helping build, because it turned out that people work harder when they're not just making some rich guy richer, but are actually building something for themselves. I'd implemented transparency policies that made all of our financial decisions visible to stakeholders, because hiding things is what people do when they're up to shady activities, and I was committed to being the opposite of everything Veronica had accused me of being. I'd even named one of the subsidiaries Patricia Tech, after my grandmother's middle name, as a tribute to the people who'd taught me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in peace of mind, in being able to sleep at night knowing you haven't screwed anyone over, in having relationships built on actual affection instead of financial calculations. The company focused on educational technology for underprivileged schools, which was exactly the kind of thing Grandma Patricia would have loved, and it was profitable enough to sustain itself while also doing genuine good in the world, which felt like winning twice. Jasmine reached over and took my hand, not in that possessive way that Veronica used to hold my hand like she was claiming property, but in that comfortable way that people do when they genuinely enjoy each other's company. "So what's next?" she asked. "Now that you've won your lawsuit, exposed corruption, honored your grandfather's legacy, and presumably traumatized your ex-wife enough that she'll need years of therapy, what does Miles Turner do for an encore?" I just laughed, because while she was chasing luxury in whatever hole she'd disappeared into, I'd found something priceless that you couldn't buy even if you had all the money in the world. I'd found freedom, the kind that comes from not being suspicious of everyone around you. I'd found self-respect, knowing I'd played the game honestly and still won. And I'd found a sense of humor sharp enough to cut through any courtroom drama, any betrayal, any scheme that people might throw at me in the future. "I don't know," I told Jasmine honestly, squeezing her hand. "Maybe we'll actually write that book. Maybe I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, running companies and trying not to be an asshole. Maybe I'll take up gardening like Grandpa and grow fancy bread from seeds." She laughed at that. "Croissants don't grow from seeds, Miles." Well, with that attitude, they definitely won't.